have your Bible or a device, I'd love for you to turn over to the Old Testament book of 1 Samuel chapter 24. 1 Samuel chapter 24. We are in week 2 of a series that we started called The Life of David. And periodically, if you're visiting with us throughout the year, we do character studies where we look through people in the Old and New Testament and we pull parts of their life out to help influence and encourage and challenge us in our walk with Christ. And David is a fantastic one. We know more about the life of David more than most, certainly Old Testament Bible figures that we have. We have David's life as a teenager. We looked at that last week, David fighting the Philistine giant Goliath. We looked at that. That's a story, 2 weeks ago rather. That's a story you know well. We teach it to our kids. This week we're going to be, and we've kind of broken this down into kind of 3 sections. We looked at the shepherd boy. That's a part of David's life that you're probably very familiar with. This is also when he was told that God is going to appoint you to be king. But the part that you have to remember, and the part that's really going to, I think, influence our time today, is the time from the time when David was told, hey, you're going to succeed Saul and you're going to be king of Israel, to the time that he was actually put in as king was approximately 15 to 20 years. I mean, it's a long period of time between when he heard what was going to come and when that day finally arrived. And you and I both know that in our lives, at least for most of us, in that interim, especially when we're waiting on something that we really want to get here, that can be hard times. And that's sort of where David was. And David had a few things going on that I think not many of us have had. We'll look at that more this morning because we're going to transition into David the fugitive. And this is a period of life when David, the king Saul, had found out that David was supposed to succeed him as king. And we'll look here in a moment. Saul began to just hear David's praises everywhere. Because remember, at this point, David has already taken down Goliath, right? David was the underdog of all underdogs, right? He is a teenage shepherd boy, the youngest of his family. He's not head and shoulders above Saul, right? He's not the physical presence, but people love David, right? David, they are singing his praises literally in the streets, and Saul was worried that the nation is going to eventually kind of rally support behind David. He already knew what God wanted, but as a lot of kings did in the Old Testament, that didn't matter so much. What he really mattered, he said, are people going to revolt and throw me out as king? And so that's kind of where our story picks up. David became great friends with Saul's son, Jonathan. And we're not going to read all of the text today. So 1 and 2 Samuel, certainly for Old Testament books, are just action-packed. The life of David is incredible. I encourage you, we're going to read parts of 1 Samuel 18, parts of 1 Samuel 24, and parts of 1 Samuel 25. But all of that middle section of 1 Samuel is this part of David's life. I encourage you to reread that at home. The fugitive, and then what Logan's going to look for us at next week, is going to be David the king. Right, David finally becomes king, and there are parts of that story that you know really well. And we're going to look at that. We're going to kind of give a little bit of the preamble of that even today, because I think a lot of times we want to jump to David the king. We want to be king. But what's amazing about David's life, and certainly the more we learn about David through some of his writings in the Psalms, we recognize that when David finally became king, there are periods of his life where he looked back at his time as a fugitive and thought, man, it wouldn't be great to go back with Jonathan, to go back with my mighty men, to be in that cave, to be close to God, right? To be protected in that cave. But then in the time when he was in the cave, there were times where he looked back and said, man, wouldn't it be great to be just a shepherd again? Right? Wouldn't it be great to not be on the run? Wouldn't it be great to not be constantly fearing for your life? David the king is probably one of the hardest seasons of his life, even though that's where we all want to jump to, right? And so I'm hoping to kind of lay some of that foundation this week, and Logan will pick it up next week. But we're going to look at David as the fugitive. And our title, if you've seen in our bulletin, is Defeating the Giant of Anger. Anger. We've looked at, this kind of been our theme. We've set our sets up 2 weeks ago, and then today we've looked at these different attributes that David struggled with, and Logan will continue that next week. We're going to look at anger this week, and this is one that all of us are acutely familiar with. I don't have to give you a pitch on why studying how to handle our anger matters, but I read this earlier in the week, and I thought, man, I don't know that we properly place this in its correct context very often. It said this: our ability to constructively control anger is one of the greatest predictors of success in life. And here was their pitch of this. And at first I thought, is that a little overreaching? Is that exaggeration perhaps for writing a book and writing an article? But here was their pitch, and the more I thought about it, the more I agree with this. They said, how we control anger in a lot of ways controls how we succeed at work. Right? When we go to work and we disagree with people, how we handle that argument can very well be the difference between promotions and not, between landing sales and not, between having a rapport with our boss and not. How we handle anger very much determines how our relationships work with our spouses, right? Great marriages have been degraded because one or both don't handle anger correctly, right? Neil talked about this in our gospel meeting this past week. Anger can very much erode that away. If you look at the psychology behind the families that have the kids that are the closest to their parents, right? The studies that have been done say that the parents that address anger in an appropriate way, and that's not to say no anger, but that's not to say unhealthy anger either, have the children that are the closest to them statistically. So when we look at this idea of anger, you might think, well, I don't have an anger problem. Anger doesn't matter, but it does. How you handle yourself when things don't go your way very much influences the rest of your life. Your job, your marriage, your relationships, period, friendships, relationship with your children. All of it comes back to how do we handle conflict. And I want to look, and David gave us some great examples this morning. 1 Samuel chapter 24 is where we're going to begin. We're going to start in 24, we're going to go back a little bit, and then we're going to go forward again, because I want to kind of present in totality what we're looking at here. So again, at this point, just to set the stage for you, Saul is aware that David has been picked to be king. Saul has already tried to kill David. Jonathan has already warned him that Saul wants him dead. And I want to look to start this all out in 1 Samuel 24. We're going to pick up in verse 2. So King Saul, took 3,000 able young men from all of Israel and set out to look for David and his men near the crags of the wild goats. I want you to put yourself in the shoes of young David. Again, this is not that long after he took down Goliath. We often talk about him being a teenager then. But this period of David's life is not that much later. We don't know exactly, but it's not that much later because David was installed as a king in his early 30s. So we think David was probably 15, 16 when Goliath happened. Here he's probably maybe 18. So still an extremely young man. And King Saul has taken 3,000 of his best soldiers to hunt one person, and that's David. Knowing, and some of the mental side of this is David knew that God had appointed him to be king, but all the while, God isn't directly showing up. Saul is still throwing spears at David. Saul is still hunting David. Saul is still on the run. And so you can begin to see, even before we go any further, you can paint this picture in your mind why this lesson is devoted to anger. Because David's going to find himself in a bit in a cave, hiding out from Saul, angry at Saul and angry at God as to why he's there. Because all of this is not David's fault. Right? All of the circumstances that he's dealing with are, by all intents and purposes, all of our assessments, unfair. David's on the run because somebody bigger than him doesn't like what has been said, right? God has chosen that David is going to be king. Saul took 3,000 able-bodied young men. I want to kind of set the stage why Saul was so frustrated. And really, frustration is probably a very kind assessment of the way Saul's been acting. Because we have multiple chapters, and we're going to start by looking at kind of the spiral that Saul really goes down. And it begins with jealousy, right? Look in 1 Samuel 18, starting in verse 8. And again, remember, this is a short time after David has taken down Goliath. And so Saul was very angry. and it displeased him greatly. They credited David with tens of thousands. He thought, but me with only thousands. What more can he get but the kingdom? And from that time on, Saul kept a close eye on David. Remember, the people, that's what Saul became concerned with, the people. The people were looking and saying, Saul's able to go get his thousands, but David is the one that took down Goliath. David is able with his tens of thousands. Saul heard this, and he became jealous. And we've done lessons on jealousy. Jealousy is this spiral that happens in our mind that can take us into places we wouldn't normally go. And that's what's happening to Saul. He's looking at David and he says, this can't be allowed to happen. I'm the king. Right? That's part of Saul's problem, and we look through that, and that's not dissimilar from the struggles we have. When we begin to make our life and our success about what I've done as opposed to God set me on the throne, we begun to have problems. And Saul, and that's part of what's going to happen in this phase of David's life. Right? David, the shepherd boy, gets a lot of press, so to speak, because of the story with Goliath. David, the king, gets a lot of our attention because we have so much of it. He wrote the Psalms, by and large, as a king. But I'm going to suggest to you that every great story of David as a king is made possible because of decisions that David made as a fugitive. When God began to test David. Because remember, the problem with Saul was Saul forgot that God made kings, that God set Saul in place. Saul began to become comfortable and proud of what Saul was capable of. And so God, in this fugitive time frame, was testing David to recognize, are you the man? Can I trust that you will put me first above everything else? And this is some of that time here. He was jealous. In verse 11, Saul began to offer threats. Saul had a spear in his hand and he hurled it, saying to himself, I will pin David to the wall. And David eluded him twice. Saul began to threaten David because now it became more than just the people love David, that's fine. But now, as we've done, it got into Saul's mind and it spiraled and he thought, I need to take care of this, right? He began to offer threats towards David. And then we look in 18 and verse 25. He began to not only offer threats, but he made plans to make sure that David was going down. Saul's plan was to have David fall, not just fall, but fall by the hands of the Philistines. And you might look at that and think, oh, well, the Philistines are an enemy of Israel. But recognize what Saul is doing is he's no dummy. Saul wanted to make sure that the Philistines were the ones that killed David because that would have completely erased any memory of David killing Goliath. Remember, David was the Philistine killer. David got rid of Goliath. But if the Philistines take him out, that no longer matters, right? That's the headline people will remember. So Saul is working all of this in the background to try to get rid of this teenager that God has appointed to be king, but wouldn't become king for at least another decade. So look at David's response, 1 Samuel 22. Go back 2 chapters. And again, we're kind of jumping around, but just this, again, this is 5-6 chapters in length, and we don't have time to read this all. But at the end of chapter 21, we know that David flees to Gath. Right, David has been threatened by Saul multiple times. Everything we just read came from chapter 18. Then Jonathan is warning him, saying, listen, my dad is getting really worked up over this. This is about to come to a head, and it does. He begins to hunt David. And notice what David's response is to being threatened, to being attacked, right? Saul had tried to throw a spear and kill him multiple times. Scripture says at least twice, but it could have happened more than that. Look at his response. And I want us to kind of look at our response to similar circumstances. David left Gath and escaped to the cave at Adullam. We look at this and we think, what a strange response. Wouldn't God swoop in? Wouldn't God come and rescue the man, the young man that he is appointed to be king? Why is he making David run off to a cold, wet cave and be on the run? I read it, I was looking through this and I was reading a commentary and they said, and I'll paraphrase, but they said, David had to spend time in a cave to get rid of the Saul in him. David had to go through some of these trials, and that's very much what they were. God is going to present David with opportunities. We're going to read this here in a moment. Saul is going to literally walk over David is the way that it presents itself. David's in this cave, and if you look back in any historical literature, shepherds used caves in that region of the world because they were safe. Right, and there's still those caves in that part of the world today, but the shepherds would have slept at the mouth of the cave to make sure that all the sheep were safe. Right, so more than likely, David did that very thing. Saul came in, probably walked right past him, and goes out, and David has an opportunity to do a couple different things, and I want us to look at his response. He left, and he went to the cave, because that's where he felt safe. He was a shepherd. This is where, and he knew these caves better than anybody, right? Shepherds in that part of the world at that time used caves to protect them from wolves and thieves, right? There were these great caves that had really small openings, and if you go look at this part of the world, they're still there. These really small mouths of a cave, but then they opened up into these huge expanses. And many believe that's where David went because that's where he kept his sheep. He knew them well. He escaped to a place of safety. But I want us to look at what David's thoughts were when he was there and then how he acted accordingly. Humility transforms anger into courage. And I want you to notice that, and that is a theme of this part of David's life. We look at David, how he acts. He has reason to be angry. We'll read about his anger in a moment, right? He has unfairly been pushed to a wet, dark cave out in the middle of nowhere, running from a king that is so paranoid that wants to remain in charge but won't give God the proper credit. This is his situation. David has every reason to be angry. But instead of allowing anger to guide the ship, instead of allowing anger to guide him, he comes to it with humility and recognizes that God is very much in control. And we see a shepherd in the field, a fugitive in the cave, and then next week we'll look at David as a king in the palace. All of which required the humility to come to God and recognize that he is in all of these circumstances because God has placed him there. Humility transforms anger into courage. I'm going to offer you kind of three scenes, again, because this is a rather long story, but I want to show you three things that we see in this cave, in this time of David on the run from Saul, dealing with anger towards God and how he addresses this. See, number one, we're going to look at temptation in the cave. We're going to look at temptation in the cave. Open back up to 1 Samuel 24 and look at verses 3 and 4. This is a story that you're probably familiar with. It says, he came to the sheep pens along the way, and a cave was there, and Saul went in it to relieve himself. David and his men were far back in the cave, and the men said, this is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish. And David crept unnoticed and cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Imagine being on the run from the king. You're hiding in a cave. You're waiting for your opportunity. You know God is on your side. God has told you that you're going to be king. God told you that you will eventually rise up above Saul. And here comes walking in Saul, having no clue that you're there. And he is quite literally with his back to you. And you make a choice. What do? Do I take this opportunity to act the way all the men expect me to act? Right? They're on the run too. The expectation is you go take the sword and you go stab Saul in the back. That is the expectation. But David looked at leadership differently. David believed that it was more advantageous, that it was more God-honoring to not. And we're going to look at in a moment more of why that is. But he crept up Because remember, more than likely, Saul would have been wearing a cloak. He would have taken that off. So David came up and just took a corner, and it's going to come back into play in a little bit. If you've heard the story, you know this. He's going to present this to Saul in a moment. We are all tempted to think that our opportunity is the worthy exemption to God's rule and to God's plan. You know, when we look at these situations in our life, we look and we see the Sauls walk in, right? We have the opportunity. We have to make a choice. We're at a fork in the road that we either go and do what we want to do that serves our interest, which is to grab the sword and go stab him in the back, the man that has been trying to hunt you down. And the men they're being his guys. They're saying, David, this has got to be that opportunity. This has got to be the time that God is intending for you to go take him out. He has been trying to kill us. This has to be it. Or we look and we say, but does this honor God in the plan that he has? I know that this makes more sense for you and me, right? We are David, and we easily justify, we say, this must be the opportunity that God's placed. This must be the one worthy exception, right? I know that this doesn't really honor God. This doesn't really fall into his plan, but boy, this makes a lot of sense, and this should be the exception rather than the rule, right? I've been on the run, metaphorically speaking. I'm on the run. My problem is right before me. Certainly God will understand. David could have succumbed to that. David could have done that very thing, but instead he cuts the corner of his robe, of Saul's robe, and we'll see more of that in a moment. So we see temptation in the cave. David had an opportunity to be tempted. David had an opportunity to allow his anger to guide his actions. How we respond in anger matters. It mattered then and it matters now. And we see scene number 2, we see conviction in the cave. We're going to see David in this cave being convicted by what God will have him to do. Let's keep going in 1 Samuel 24 and read verses 5 through 7. Notice this. This is right after he had the opportunity to go kill Saul. He just took a corner of his robe instead. It says, afterward, David was conscience stricken. That's a really amazing Hebrew word that gets translated very few times, that exact word. But it literally means that David's heart and that David's spirit was in knots. He was conscience stricken for having cut off a corner of the robe. He said to his men, the Lord forbid that I should do such a thing. Notice this. To my master, the Lord's anointed, or lay my hand on him, for he is the anointed of the Lord. I want to just pause. Is that the way you and I approach things when we're angry? Do you and I have the wherewithal? Do you and I have the spiritual fortitude? Do we have the maturity to recognize that even when we're mad, God is still king? That even when we're mad and angry and have reason to be mad and angry, we go and that we are still responsible for the way that we act. And David says, in spite of the fact that he's tried to kill us, in spite of the fact that we're living in a cave on the run for him, God is still king, and God has placed him as king. You know, in the back of your mind, David is also wrestling with God has placed him as king, and God is now pointing to me to be king. And so David's recognizing that the men that are with him are making judgment calls already. Are we going to serve a king that is going to go stab somebody in the back when they have no opportunity to defend themselves and God has told them not to? Or do we have a king that honors the one true king? And David's making those choices. The Lord forbid that I do this, because the Lord's anointed Saul, in spite of his sin, God had already given him a command. Verse 7, with these words, David sharply rebuked his men and did not allow them to attack Saul. And Saul left the cave and went on his way. When you and I are angry, it starts with temptation. We're tempted to act in a way that's unbecoming of God and unbecoming of us as Christian. But then I hope that in every time that we get angry, when we have opportunity to sin, Scripture tells us that David's conscience was in knots because of the opportunity it was placed before him. I'm going to give you a very simple litmus test. And this doesn't happen every time. But when you and I engage in a situation like this, when we have sin presented before us, more specifically, when we have a situation that we are angry over, real anger, not just a mild frustration, but we are angry, does our conscience, does the way that God feels about our actions and our words, does it play any bearing on our decisions? When we're presented with Saul with his back to us, we have an opportunity to act A or B. If somebody were to chronicle our life, does the phrase "was conscience stricken," does that ever enter the equation for us? Or do we simply look at it and say, what serves me best? Right? Killing Saul serves me best. That protects me. But it doesn't honor God. How are we making our choices? Do we look at it as what honors God, His will, His desire? Or is it simply what is most advantageous for me at this time? David rebuked his men, and Saul left and went on his way. I read it this way: a soft conscience, and soft in the best way, a moldable conscience that God has influence on. Very much what I would describe David as. That is rightly attuned to the will of God is one of the greatest shields a person can have. That protected David from making the wrong choice there. His conscience, the will of God came and helped him make a choice that his mind, his heart, his friends did not want him to make. It's still true for you and me. I want to jump briefly, and this may seem like a weird transition, but I want to look briefly in Ephesians 4. Because as I was studying through this, I thought, I'm offering a lot of challenge. And at least in David's case, we see the practical meat in action, but we don't see a lot of the instruction as to how to get there. But Paul in Ephesians chapter 4 offers us this, and we're not even going to read this for the sake of time. But I encourage you to read Ephesians 4 when you get home this afternoon. This is, of course, a letter that Paul wrote to the church in Ephesus, a church that he loved dearly. And in Ephesians 4, about midway through, he begins to deal with the idea and what I've just described as biblical principles of anger. And I want to offer them to you as really kind of the practical parallel to the story of 1 Samuel 24 in the life of David. David exemplifies what Paul talks about in Ephesians 4. I want this to be the practical meat, and then we'll end back up in 1 Samuel chapter 24. Real quick, 4 biblical principles of anger, because this is our topic this morning. Number 1, anger alone is not a sin. But equally, it's not an excuse for sin either. Ephesians 4 points to us, in your anger, do not sin. They are two connected but separate entities, right? Anger alone is not sin. You and I have to act on something, a sinful action, conjoined with that anger to make it sinful. But in that same breath, you and I being angry, saying, well, I was so mad, that's not an excuse in God's eyes to sin. At judgment, that's not going to mean anything to come to God and say, but God, don't you recognize that I had reason to be angry? Yes, so did Christ. So did David. So did Paul. How we choose to respond should differentiate you and me as Christians. Anger is not a sin, but it does not excuse sin either. Number 2, anger is best resolved quickly. Easier said than done, but Paul encourages them in Ephesians 4, don't let the sun go down. Don't let the day come to a close angry. Friends, anger is a cancer. It is a cancer that tears away at you, at your relationships, at your connection to the Father. There were points where Christ was angry. God is angry. Scripture tells us that God has been angry. Christ has been angry. Anger alone is okay. But the real challenge, and if we had 2 lessons on this, there'd be a follow-up with what defines biblical anger. And I'll sum it up very quickly with this. Good, righteous anger very seldomly is about you. God is angry when other people are hurt, when things that happen that unfairly happen and other people are harmed. When you and I begin to get angry over things that influence us because our interests aren't being served, our ego is not being inflated, we have a problem. But when we become angry because other people are being harmed, because things unjust happen in the world, that would be very broadly described as the righteous anger that we see Christ show and God show. But anger is best resolved quickly. Easier said than done, but if possible, resolve it so that we can start the next day fresh. Number 3, anger grows back if it's not fully addressed. Friends, anger will come back over and over and over until you put it in its place. Ephesians 4 talks about get rid of it all. You and I are tempted to think that 95% is good enough, right? Satan would love for you to believe that 95% in a lot of areas is good enough, right? Give God 95% of your life. Surely that's enough for him. Is it that big a deal to hold on to 5%? We talk about anger. Shouldn't it be okay to just get rid of most of it? But Paul says, no, it's not good enough. Not only is it not good enough, but it's not actually solving anything. It will come back. And then lastly, anger can facilitate forgiveness. Forgive as you have been forgiven. Anger alone is not a sin. How we act, how we respond. And I hope that you've seen all 4 of these beautifully shown in the life of David. You'll see it more next week as king. We certainly see it as him as fugitive. How we respond to anger matters. So we get to scene number 3, and then we're going to wrap up this morning. Scene number 3, we start with temptation in the cave, we move to conviction in the cave, and we end with transformation in the cave. Transformation that happens. And I want you to listen to the way David describes this. We'll look back in 1 Samuel chapter 24, beginning in verse 8. It says, then David went out of the cave and called to Saul, my Lord the king. When Saul looked behind him, notice this, David bowed before him, prostrate himself to the face to the ground. He said, Saul, why do you listen when men say David is bent on harming you? This day you have seen with your own eyes how the Lord delivered you into my hands into the cave. Some urged me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not lay a hand on my Lord because he is the Lord's anointed. See, my father took at this piece of your robe in my hand. I cut off the corner of your robe, but didn't kill you. See that there is nothing in my hand to indicate that I'm guilty of wrongdoing or rebellion. I've not wronged you, but you are hunting me down to take my life. May the Lord judge between you and me, and may the Lord avenge the wrongs that you have done to me, but my hand will not touch you. Friends, we don't know exactly how long David spent in the caves. It could have been as long as 6 months. But David was transformed in that time. He was transformed from the anger of, why am I here to start with? Why am I being punished for somebody else's ego? Why am I being punished for somebody else's paranoia? Why am I being punished, most importantly, for somebody else's unfaithfulness? Why am I being punished for Saul's rebellion? Because Saul doesn't believe that God is sitting on the throne any longer and he's no longer acting accordingly. Why am I being punished? But then we see the conviction and the transformation that comes, and he says, Saul, I've been given an opportunity, but God placed you as king. And if God has placed you as king, I won't take that away. May God avenge the wrongs, but my hand will not touch you. And you notice, and the way I love at the end of this is David's response to anger was not about Saul. Do you realize that? David's dealing with anger doesn't start with, in fact, it has nothing to do with Saul. And that's the great beauty of anger and repentance and forgiveness is so often we think it's about the other person. We think to forgive somebody, to go through these steps that they play some role in this. But you recognize forgiveness is more for you. It doesn't matter what they do, whether they reciprocate or not. Forgiveness is about getting rid of what you feel. And it's about coming to God and saying, I am relinquishing all the feeling here. And David is doing that with Saul, saying, Saul, let God is going to deal with all this, but as far as I'm concerned, I'm not going to harm you. Friends, being angry is a choice. How you respond to anger is a choice. Anger alone is not a sin, but friends, how you respond very well could be. Anger and how we respond to it matters. The life of David, we see him as a shepherd. We see him not too much longer as a fugitive. And then next week, we're going to look at him as a king. And you're going to see all throughout that time, David makes mistakes, just like you and me. David has some great successes, but always comes back to the humility to recognize that God is on the throne, that God makes decisions, that God keeps the world turning. And David's greatest successes come when he is acutely aware of that. David's greatest psalms that he wrote basically point back to that. Some of them, when he's on a spiritual mountaintop, are just affirming what he already knows about God. But a few of his probably most well-known psalms are when he's really in a valley and he's forgotten that. But he comes back and says, God, I'm wrong. I'm wrong for having believed otherwise. I'm sorry for acting accordingly. This morning, we want to give you the opportunity. We always offer the invitation. Anger probably interacts with all of us. We all struggle with it to some degree, and how we respond matters. Christ came to this earth on our behalf and had every reason, more so than David, had every reason to be angry, had every reason to come down off the cross, had every reason to wipe the world of all the people that had done him wrong, but he didn't. So that you and I can go and have an opportunity to be in heaven with him one day. This morning, if you aren't a Christian, we want to give you that opportunity to come and put on Christ in baptism. If we can help you at all this morning, would you come let us know about it as we stand and as we sing together?